Welcome to Simplified UPSC by PPP, where we listen, learn, and grow together. Detailed lecture notes in English and Hindi, plus practice questions for prelims and mains, only on our Telegram channel. Link in description. Like and subscribe for more.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a deep breath, maybe putting on some virtual waders, and sinking into one of the most vital parts of our planet, often overlooked, I think, but absolutely critical, the wetlands. You know, if you're serious about understanding conservation, ecology, even things like urban planning these days, this topic is just fundamental. We often call them the kidneys of the landscape, and there's a very good reason for that. They filter our water, they regulate climate, protect our coasts, are really the unsung heroes of environmental stability.
That's a perfect way to put it, a really excellent starting point, and it frames our mission today perfectly. We are diving deep into the wetland ecosystem, and importantly for you listening, we're drawing exclusively from the provided source material. The aim is to build a really solid, robust, conceptual and factual foundation. Our focus today will be pretty relentless, actually. We need to define the huge scope of these ecosystems, explore their incredible functions, including that critical role in climate mitigation you touched on. Then we'll delve into the global governance side, the Ramsar Convention. We'll analyze India's national efforts, and then wrap up with a critical look at the, frankly, alarming threats they face. This is absolutely foundational knowledge if you want a comprehensive grip on environmental issues.
Okay, fantastic. Let's jump right in then. We need to start with the definition, but maybe unpack the idea that it's much broader than just, the stereotypical image of a swamp. So under this key framework, the Ramsar Convention, what's the precise, the expansive scope of the ecosystem we're actually talking about here?
Right. The term wetland, particularly as defined by the Convention on Wetlands, Ramsar, that is, it's deliberately, I'd say remarkably broad. And that's intentional, to ensure that as many vital habitats as possible are covered for conservation efforts. The Convention's main goal, remember, is conservation and this concept of wise use, which really necessitates a very all-encompassing definition.
Okay, so it's intentionally broad. How does the Ramsar definition then break down this huge variety? How do we get beyond just thinking about swamps and marshes?
Well, the defining characteristics fundamentally relate to the presence of water. That's key. It could be permanent water or seasonal. And critically, the spiralized vegetation that results from that water presence. The main way we distinguish them is first, based on location, are they inland or coastal? And then secondly, by their origin, are they natural or are they man-made? The detailed classification we have from the sources really emphasizes this incredible diversity.
Right. So inland versus coastal, natural versus man-made. Let's break that down. What falls under inland wetlands?
Okay, so for inland wetlands, the natural category is itself pretty vast. It includes the obvious things like perennial lakes and ponds, water bodies, they're year-round. Then you have geographically distinct features like oxbow lakes, those crescent-shaped lakes formed by meandering rivers. Also naturally waterlogged areas, places just naturally prone to saturation. And then those really crucial habitats like seasonal wetlands, places that might dry out periodically but are still ecologically vital, and of course the general swamp and marsh areas.
That point about seasonal wetlands is really important, isn't it? It tells us the water doesn't have to be there all the time for it to count, for it to have that critical ecological function. But what about the man-made inclusions? This is where, for me, the scope gets, startlingly wide.
It does, yeah. On the man-made side, for inland areas, we find these large, often intentional constructions, things like reservoirs and tanks built for water storage. Then there are other man-made waterlogged areas, often created maybe inadvertently through things like irrigation systems leaking or altering drainage. And then, maybe surprisingly for some, you find industrial features listed, like ash ponds. These are ponds used to dispose of ash from, say, thermal power plants.
Ash ponds. Wow, okay, so the inclusion of industrial byproducts like that really shows the conservation framework has to adapt, doesn't it? It has to deal with the reality of human activity, recognizing that even these, unintended water bodies can sometimes develop wetland characteristics, or at least need managing.
Exactly. It underscores that conservation policy isn't just about pristine, untouched nature. It's increasingly about managing the entire human-influenced landscape. Now, if we shift focus to that boundary zone where land meets the coastal wetlands...
Yeah, what do we find there?
Coastal areas present an even more complex interface, arguably. Naturally occurring coastal wetlands include estuaries, those large, really important transitional zones where rivers meet the sea, also lagoons, creeks, and backwaters often found along coastlines, bays as well. Then you have the ecologically crucial coral reefs. Yes, they fall under the definition too. Plus tidal flats, those areas exposed at low tide. And of course, the very significant mangroves and salt marshes. These natural coastal wetlands are incredibly, incredibly productive ecosystems.
And the man-made coastal ones, similar to inland.
Somewhat. Man-made coastal wetlands primarily cover areas that have been converted or created for resource extraction or cultivation. Specifically, the sources mention salt pans, large, shallow ponds designed for salt production through evaporation, and also large areas dedicated to aquaculture like shrimp farms or fish farms.
Yeah, that's an incredible spectrum. From high-altitude Himalayan lakes all the way down to submerged coral reefs and aquaculture ponds. Now, the source material specifically flags the classification of brackish water ecosystems. Could you just detail that for us? What's the precise salinity range that defines this unique environment?
Absolutely. This is a key characteristic for understanding coastal systems. The source clearly classifies brackish water ecosystems based on their salinity level. Specifically, it defines them as water bodies having a salt content in the range of 5 to 35 parts per thousand, often written as FUPOPs. So saltier than fresh water, but generally less salty than the open ocean, which is typically around 35 ppd or more. This specific salinity gradient is crucial because it defines those critical coastal features we mentioned: estuaries, salt marshes, and the highly specialized mangrove swamps and forests. These environments are, high-stress zones from a salinity perspective. Only specially adapted plants and animals can thrive there. Understanding that precise salinity measure, 5 to 35 ppt, is really key to defining their unique ecological character and why they function the way they do.
Right, so now we have a much clearer picture of what a wetland actually is. A huge range, from a temporary floodplain maybe, right up to a coral reef or a mangrove forest. But the big question is why? Why does this incredibly diverse collection of habitats merit things like international treaties and intense national conservation efforts? What's the actual value of this ecosystem?
Well, this is where it gets really fascinating. Wetlands, you could say, punch far, far above their weight in terms of the environmental services they provide. They are absolutely central to global environmental stability and, crucially, to human livelihood as well. This really justifies your earlier description of them as the kidneys of the landscape. They regulate, they filter, they sustain life in so many ways.
Okay, let's unpack that kidney role a bit more, the hydrological regulation and the disaster mitigation aspect. How does the actual physical structure of a wetland contribute to, well, stability?
They are enormously significant in hydrological regulation. Think about inland wetlands first. They often act like natural sponges, don't they? They absorb huge amounts of water during peak flow events, like heavy rainfall or snowmelt. By holding that water back and releasing it slowly, they significantly reduce the severity of floods downstream. And at the same time, that absorbed water can slowly percolate down, recharging vital groundwater resources. The source material highlights this dual-function flood control and groundwater recharge as a really significant general service provided by pretty much all types of wetlands.
Okay, so sponges inland. What about on the coast? You mentioned mangroves earlier.
Yes, coastal wetlands and mangroves are the prime example here. Take this protective function to a whole other level. They play an absolutely key role in moderating the impact of severe monsoonal tidal floods. And they critically reduce the extent of inundation, how far inland floodwaters reach in low-lying coastal areas. Mangroves are quite literally physical bulwarks. Their dense, tangled, specialized root systems are incredibly effective at dissipating wave energy. This provides critical storm and erosion protection, effectively shielding coastal lands, infrastructure, and communities from the devastating impacts of things like tsunamis, hurricanes, and just general storm surges and floods. They are arguably the planet's most effective natural coastal defense system.
That's the regulation side, holding back water, protecting coasts. Now, what about the purification side? How do these ecosystems manage to act like kidneys and filter water and waste?
They function as highly effective natural filters. It's quite remarkable. They trap sediments suspended in the water, which clarifies the water column. They also process excess nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, often from agricultural runoff or sewage, preventing downstream eutrophication, those harmful algal blooms. And they can even trap or break down certain chemical pollutants. This filtration is vital for maintaining water quality, both for ecosystems and for human use. Consider estuaries again. They act as a kind of natural chemical filter for some dissolved constituents carried by river water. As the fresh water, often rich in sediments and maybe dissolved chemicals from upstream, meets the salty seawater. The change in the chemical environment causes many of those dissolved substances to precipitate out. They literally fall out of the water column and get trapped in the estuarine sediments.
So kind of a natural chemical reaction cleans the water.
In a way, yes, it's a natural flocculation and precipitation process. This natural filtering capacity means that wetlands are actually utilized extensively, sometimes even designed for natural waste treatment systems. They intercept and help neutralize pollutants before they can affect sensitive downstream ecosystems like coral reefs or contaminant sources of drinking water.
Incredible. So stability, filtration. What about life itself? Wetlands are globally recognized as biodiversity hotspots, aren't they?
Absolutely irreplaceable habitats.
What?
Yes, wetlands are crucial for an enormous diversity of aquatic plants and animals. They notably support massive numbers of birds. Many species depend entirely on wetlands for breeding, feeding, or resting during migration. They often serve as vital stopover points and wintering grounds on major global flyways for migratory birds. And the sheer complexity of these systems, the mix of water depths, vegetation types, edge habitats, means they support entire complex food webs from microorganisms right up to large vertebrates.
And the source mentioned mangroves specifically in this context, too.
It did. Mangroves are specifically noted for enhancing the natural recycling of nutrients. Their falling leaves and twigs, detritus, form the base of a very productive detrital food chain, which supports fisheries far beyond the mangrove forest itself. Crucially, they provide these safe, sheltered, and nutrient-rich environments that serve as critical breeding, spawning, and nursery grounds for numerous species of fish, shrimp, crabs, and other commercially important species. This incredible biological productivity means that estuaries in general are considered highly productive biological zones. They really form the foundation for immense marine and coastal fisheries that millions rely on.
Okay, and building on that productivity and ecological function, let's integrate that really strategic role of coastal wetlands, the one we touched on earlier. Their importance in global climate regulation, the blue carbon idea.
Yes, blue carbon. This concept is absolutely paramount to understanding their strategic importance today. Coastal wetlands, we're talking primarily mangroves, tidal salt marshes, and also seagrass meadows. Though mangroves and marshes are often highlighted, are globally recognized now as some of the most efficient natural systems on Earth for sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They capture this carbon and store it, often for very long periods, primarily in their dense waterlogged soils, but also in their biomass, the wood, roots, and leaves. This stored carbon is what we call blue carbon. And here's the kicker. The source material points toward studies showing they can sequester carbon up to, potentially, 5 times more efficiently per unit area than many temperate forests.
Wow, 5 times more efficient. That's a huge number. That really reframes things, doesn't it? It means protecting, say, a hectare of mangrove swamp could be strategically more critical for climate mitigation than protecting even 5 hectares of certain types of terrestrial forest. That elevates wetland conservation way beyond just local flood control or biodiversity. It's a major climate solution.
Exactly. That's the critical insight. They're simultaneously providing local flood protection, they're purifying water, they're supporting biodiversity hotspots, and they are acting as globally significant carbon sinks. It means their loss is a double, even triple whammy. We lose the carbon sink, potentially releasing stored carbon. We lose the flood protection. We lose the biodiversity. Losing them actually contributes exponentially to climate change impacts while simultaneously reducing our natural defenses against those very impacts like sea level rise and stronger storms.
Okay. And finally, we absolutely must acknowledge their direct link to human livelihoods. It's not just about abstract ecosystem services. For many communities, it's about economic necessity, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely indispensable. You can't separate the ecological function from the human dependence in many cases. Wetlands provide essential resources directly used by people. Food, like fish and edible plants, fiber from reeds and grasses used for weaving or construction, and other raw materials. They directly support major livelihood activities. Commercial fishing, both coastal and inland, often relies heavily on wetland productivity. Tourism, like birdwatching or nature tours, is increasingly important in some areas. And critically, especially in the Indian context, as highlighted by our source, a massive portion of agriculture depends on wetlands. The sheer scale mentioned is frankly shocking. Our sources note that wetlands occupy about 18.4% of India's total area. And then this statistic, an enormous 70% of that total wetland area in India is currently under paddy cultivation, rice farming.
70%. That's staggering. It fundamentally links wetland health, or at least wetland water management, directly to national food security and water security, doesn't it?
Inextricably linked, yes. It means wetland management in India is deeply intertwined with agricultural policy, water resource allocation, and rural livelihoods.
Right, so given this staggering list of functions, flood control, water purification, biodiversity, blue carbon storage, livelihoods, it becomes really clear these environments are just too important to be left to chance or purely to national interest alone, which leads us perfectly into the key international treaty that governs them, the Ramsar Convention. Take us back. When did the world collectively agree that wetlands were a global priority needing this kind of framework?
The recognition actually came relatively early in the modern environmental movement. The Convention on Wetlands, which gets its common name from the city it was signed in, Ramsar in Iran, was adopted back in 1971. It actually entered into force in 1975. It stands as the first of the modern global intergovernmental treaties focused purely on the conservation and sustainable use of a specific ecosystem type. Its core objective, stated right from the beginning, is the conservation and, crucially, the concept of wise use of all wetlands.
Okay, 1971. And it's built around core commitments, right? The source talks about 3 pillars. What are those foundational pillars that countries signing up the contracting parties must uphold?
That's right. The convention's effectiveness rests on these 3 main pillars, which really form the structure of commitment for the parties. Pillar number 1 is the commitment to wise use. This is fundamental. Contracting parties agree to work towards the wise use of all wetlands and water resources within their territory. Not just the designated famous ones, but all of them. This is the core conceptual commitment, and it requires finding that balance between conservation needs and sustainable human requirements, fitting it into national planning and development goals.
Okay, wise use of all wetlands. What's the second pillar?
The second pillar is the Ramsar List designation. Parties are obligated to designate suitable wetlands within their territory for the list of wetlands of international importance. This is the famous Ramsar list. But designation isn't just putting a name on a list. It comes with a commitment to ensure the effective management of those sites. Adding a site confers international recognition, prestige even, but more importantly, it signifies a formal governmental commitment to maintain the site's fundamental ecological character. What makes it internationally important in the first place?
Right, so designation implies responsibility. And the third pillar?
The third pillar is international cooperation. Recognizing that water, wetlands, and the species that depend on them often cross national borders, parties agree to cooperate internationally. This cooperation applies specifically to transboundary wetlands, shared water systems like river basins, shared migratory species that depend on wetlands across different countries, and also on development projects that might have impacts across borders affecting wetlands. It acknowledges that ecological reality often ignores political maps.
Let's pause on that concept you mentioned right at the start of the pillars. Wise use. It sounds straightforward, maybe, but it seems like the real crux of the convention. How do our sources actually define this? It's clearly not just locking wetlands away untouched, is it? It sounds like a difficult balancing act.
It absolutely is a balancing act, and it's the philosophical heart of the Ramsar Convention. The official definition of wise use is the maintenance of their ecological character, achieved through the implementation of ecosystem approaches within the context of sustainable development. So let's break that down slightly. Maintaining ecological character means ensuring the wetland continues to function naturally, providing those services like flood control, filtration, habitat support we discussed. Ecosystem approaches means managing the wetland not in isolation, but as part of the wider landscape and river basin, considering all the ecological connections. And within the context of sustainable development means acknowledging that people use and depend on wetlands and finding ways for that use to continue sustainably without degrading the wetland's core functions. So it's absolutely not preservation at all costs in the sense of excluding humans entirely, nor is it just about, say, sustainable harvesting levels. It requires active, adaptive, integrated management that ensures the wetland retains its natural ability to perform its vital functions even while potentially supporting local livelihoods or other human activities. It's a dynamic concept.
That's a really crucial clarification. Maintaining ecological character through sustainable development. Okay, now another key piece of Ramsar terminology that listeners, especially those preparing for exams, need to know. The Montreux Record. What exactly is that? What's its function, and why does being placed on the Montreux Record carry such significance, or maybe even stigma?
The Montreux Record is a very specific tool within the Ramsar framework. It functions as a register, essentially a watch list. It specifically lists those Ramsar sites, those designated wetlands of international importance, where adverse ecological changes have occurred, are occurring, or are likely to occur. And these changes must be resulting from things like technological developments, pollution, or other forms of human interference. So it's not just any list. It's a mechanism for highlighting serious problems. Being placed on the Montreux Record essentially triggers deeper scrutiny from the Ramsar Convention bodies. You could see it as a form of diplomatic alert or international warning signal. It flags that despite the international designation, national management has, for whatever reason, failed to prevent significant degradation. It signals to the global community that this internationally important site is under severe threat, its ecological character is compromised, and it requires immediate, perhaps internationally supported, intensive conservation attention. So yes, it does carry significant weight.
Okay, so it's a critical status indicator for threatened Ramsar sites. Now, bringing it back to India. The source material indicates India became a contracting party to Ramsar way back in 1981. What's India's current standing, according to the source? And has India taken any specific steps within this global framework that are highlighted?
Yes, India's commitment dates back to February 1st, 1981, demonstrating quite an early engagement with the convention. According to the data presented in the source material we're using for this deep dive, India presently, and note data can change, but based on this source, has 26 sites designated as wetlands of international importance, or Ramsar sites. Listeners should always check for the latest numbers from official sources. Beyond just designating sites, the source notes that India has actually taken a proactive role in shaping how the convention is applied globally. Specifically, it mentions India has taken a lead role in formulating specific Ramsar guidelines focused on a very complex issue. The practical integration of wetland conservation and management into broader river basin management plans. This is really important because it acknowledges that a wetland's health, especially inland ones, is entirely dependent on what happens upstream, the quantity and quality of water flowing into it, which is governed by river basin policies. India's work here tries to bridge that gap. Right, so that leads us nicely into focusing more specifically on the Indian context. And here, the sheer volume, the scale, and the incredible diversity of wetlands present a really unique management challenge.
Give us those numbers again, just to grasp the scale within India. How widespread are these ecosystems across the country?
The scale is truly immense. The source states India has a recorded total of 27,403 wetlands identified. And the vast majority of these are inland wetlands, accounting for 23,444 of that total, compared to 3,959 identified coastal wetlands. Overall, wetlands occupy a really substantial portion of the country's landmass. About 18.4% of India's total geographical area is classified as wetland.
18.4%. That's nearly a fifth of the country. And the other statistic you mentioned earlier comes back here that 70% of this vast wetland area is under paddy cultivation. The complexity of managing that just boggles the mind. It must completely define water politics and land use debates in many regions.
It absolutely does. You've hit the nail on the head. When 7 out of every 10 hectares recognized as wetland area are actively used for rice agriculture, it creates this fundamental, ongoing tension. A tension between the wetland's natural ecological function and the undeniable human economic necessity, particularly food production. Many of these agricultural lands rely intrinsically on seasonal monsoonal flooding and carefully controlled water flow regimes. It really blurs the line between what we might think of as a natural ecosystem and a heavily engineered anthropogenic landscape. So conservation efforts in India simply cannot adopt a fences and fines approach for a huge portion of its wetlands. They must find ways to integrate sustainable agricultural practices, ensuring water quality and maintaining some ecological functions alongside rice production. It's incredibly complex.
And geographically, they're everywhere,
Right.
right? Not just agricultural plains.
Oh, absolutely everywhere. The geographical diversity is astounding. Natural wetlands in India range from the unique high-altitude wetlands found in the Himalayas, often glacial lakes or marshes, down to the vast dynamic floodplains associated with major river systems like the Ganges and Brahmaputra. You also have saline and temporary wetlands characteristic of arid and semi-arid regions like in Rajasthan and Gujarat. And then, of course, the whole suite of coastal types we discussed earlier. Alluvions like Chilika, mangroves like the Sundarbans, estuaries, backwaters in Kerala, coral reefs. It's an incredibly rich tapestry. Now, this complexity, the scale, this human dependence, it all necessitates a robust national response. And that brings us to the main program mentioned in the source, the National Wetland Conservation Program, NWCP.
Okay, the NWCP. What are its specific jobs? What's its mandate? And what kind of support does it actually offer to the states where these wetlands are located?
The NWCP has several clear, non-negotiable aims according to the source. Primarily, its role is to lay down comprehensive policy guidelines for wetland conservation across the entire country, providing a unified national framework. Secondly, it acts as a crucial channel for providing financial and technical assistance to state governments. This funding is specifically for undertaking intensive conservation measures in identified priority wetlands. Furthermore, the NWCP is tasked with monitoring the implementation of these conservation programs, seeing what works and what doesn't, and critically, it's responsible for preparing and maintaining a systematic, ideally up-to-date inventory of all Indian wetlands. Knowing what you have is the first step to managing it.
That makes sense. But in India's federal structure, the question of responsibility is always key. Land is a state subject. So who holds the ultimate primary responsibility for actually managing these wetlands on the ground? Is it Delhi or the state capitals?
The roles are quite clearly separated in the framework described, reflecting India's constitutional division of powers. The central government, primarily through the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, which runs the NWCP, is responsible for the overall coordination of wetland conservation programs. They handle international liaison, like with the Ramsar Convention Secretariat. They set the national guidelines, provide the bulk of the financial support, and offer technical expertise to the states. However, and this is the crucial part, the state governments and union territory administrations hold the primary day-to-day responsibility for the actual management of wetlands within their borders. They are responsible for implementing the NWCP guidelines and ensuring the wise use of their wetlands. This is because, as you said, land resources fundamentally belong to the states under the Constitution. So the real hands-on conservation, the enforcement, the local planning integration, that has to happen at the state level.
Okay, so the center provides the framework, the funding, the overarching strategy. But the ultimate success or failure of conservation for any particular wetland really rests with the state government's capacity, its political will, and its ability to implement those plans effectively on the ground.
Precisely. It's a model of cooperative federalism, in theory. And this decentralized management structure, this emphasis on state responsibility, is further reinforced and echoed in broader national policy documents. The source mentions the National Conservation Strategy and Policy Statements on Environment and Development from 1992, and also the National Water Policy of 2002. Both of these high-level policy documents explicitly highlight the conservation and sustainable development of wetlands as an embedded national priority, lending further weight to the state's role.
Okay, so we firmly established just how vital wetlands are for water security, for climate resilience, for biodiversity, for food security, livelihoods. The list goes on, and we have international agreements like Ramsar, national programs like the NWCP, clear policy statements. Yet the stark reality seems to be that wetlands are disappearing or degrading at an alarming rate worldwide, and certainly in India too. Why is there this huge disconnect? What are the major forces endangering these absolutely critical ecosystems?
That really is the most pressing question, isn't it? Despite all the recognition of their value, the threats are severe and pervasive. The general data cited in our source material is genuinely alarming. Globally, something like 45% of wetlands are considered under threat. And even more worryingly, a shocking 94% of globally significant wetlands, presumably including many Ramsar sites, are facing threats. That figure is incredibly high. The primary drivers are, unfortunately, numerous and interconnected. They often boil down to the relentless conflict between perceived short-term economic gains and the need for long-term ecological stability and resilience.
Okay, let's break down some of the specific threats mentioned. Urbanization and land conversion seem like some of the most immediate physical threats. How does that play out?
They are often existential threats, especially for wetlands near growing towns and cities or in coastal areas attractive for development. Human settlements and infrastructure projects, ports, industries, housing frequently favor coastal zones and estuarine channels for obvious reasons like access and flat land. This leads directly, often permanently, to the conversion and physical reclamation of wetland land. filling them in, basically. The source gives specific documented instances. It mentions the reclaiming of fringed wetland areas, particularly around lagoons like Chilika in Odisha and Pulicat Lake on the Andhra Pradesh-Tamil Nadu border, specifically for intensive aquaculture. Shrimp farming is often the culprit, and it explicitly states that this kind of conversion directly obstructs the natural migratory routes essential for fish and prawn larvae coming in from the sea to grow in the lagoon. This fundamentally damages the biological productivity and the fisheries potential of those entire systems.
So the very development aimed at exploiting the resource ends up destroying its foundation.
Precisely. It's a classic, unsustainable pattern. The destruction is often highly specific and documented. The source explicitly mentions the mangroves of Pichavaram and Vedaranyam, both in Tamil Nadu, as being degraded due to the construction of aquaculture ponds and also salt pans. Think about that trade-off. You take a complex, functioning mangrove ecosystem, which provides storm protection, nurseries for fish, stores massive amounts of blue carbon, and you replace it with, essentially, an artificial, economically often fragile monoculture pond that completely eliminates all those original vital ecological services.
Right. And then there's pollution. If wetlands are the kidneys, pollution must be like kidney disease, completely overwhelming their natural function.
That's a very apt analogy. Pollution can be catastrophic for wetlands because, while they are effective filters up to a point, they're ultimately passive recipients. When the loaded pollutants entering the system exceeds their natural capacity to absorb, trap, or break down those pollutants, the system fails. It gets overwhelmed. Wetlands across India, particularly those near urban and industrial centers, are reported as being severely affected by the dumping of untreated or poorly treated civic sewage and industrial waste. Our sources specifically cite severe pollution examples in major estuarine channels, like the Hooghly Estuary near Kolkata and the Zwari Estuary in Goa.
And what kinds of pollutants are we talking about?
It's a whole cocktail, unfortunately. Massive inputs of domestic sewage bring in pathogens and huge amounts of organic matter, which depletes oxygen as it decomposes. Industrial effluents can contain heavy metals, toxic chemicals, and other persistent pollutants. And agricultural runoff carries pesticides, herbicides, and vast quantities of fertilizers, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, which trigger eutrophication, leading to those damaging algal blooms that choke the ecosystem. We also see these destructive feedback loops mentioned. The source points to pollution originating from activities within the wetland itself. Specifically, it mentioned the polluting of the environment in Chilika Lake through the intensive feeding practices used for stocked fish and prawns grown in pens inside the lagoon. The excess feed and waste products foul the water. This is a stark case where an unsustainable economic activity directly poisons the very natural resource base it relies upon.
That's incredibly short-sighted. Okay, and finally, there's the more subtle but perhaps equally powerful threat, the alteration of water flow itself, the very lifeblood of any wetland.
Yes, hydrological alterations are absolutely critical and perhaps sometimes underestimated. They're particularly damaging for river-dependent ecosystems like inland floodplains, riverine marshes, and definitely estuaries. Large-scale water infrastructure projects things like building big dams upstream, extensive canal networks for irrigation, or diverting water for cities and industries fundamentally alter the natural flow regimes of rivers. This reduces the amount of fresh water reaching downstream wetlands. It changes the timing of flows, disrupting natural flood pulses that many wetlands rely on. And critically, dams trap sediment. This reduces the sediment load reaching downstream areas like deltas and estuaries, which need that sediment supply to counteract natural subsidence and erosion. Starving them of sediment can lead to land loss. For estuaries, that precise mix of fresh water flowing down the river and salt water coming in from the sea is vital. Reducing the freshwater input drastically changes the salinity balance, affecting all the adapted plant and animal life.
So tampering with the water source can unravel the whole system downstream.
Exactly. And on top of these large-scale alterations, the source also mentions other pressures. Things like the overexploitation of target fish stocks, simply catching too many fish due to increased market demand, especially in productive estuaries, and also more diffuse pressures like woodcutting, particularly in mangrove areas, for fuel or timber. All these factors, conversion, pollution, hydrological changes, overexploitation, contribute cumulatively to this constant erosion of the ecological character, that very thing the Ramsar Convention seeks to maintain.
Right, we've covered an enormous amount of ground there, from the definition right through to the destruction. Before we wrap up with takeaways, let's circle back explicitly to that core operational principle of the Ramsar Convention we discussed. For you listening, especially if you're planning your study approach, let's get really clear. What exactly does the wise use of wetlands mean in practice? How is it sharply distinguished from just simple preservation like locking an area up?
That distinction is probably the single most important conceptual point to grasp about Ramsar, I agree. Wise use, to reiterate its core, fundamentally refers to maintaining the ecological character of wetlands, keeping them healthy and functional. The key is how you achieve that. The convention says it's achieved through implementing ecosystem approaches, thinking holistically about the wetland and its connections within the context of sustainable development. So it's precisely that conceptual balance. Conservation is the goal, maintaining that ecological character is the goal, but human use and needs are explicitly acknowledged and need to be integrated into the management plan. It might mean allowing, for example, sustainable commercial fishing or traditional reed harvesting or carefully managed rice farming, or perhaps ecotourism. But, and this is the condition, only if those activities are managed in a way that demonstrably does not compromise the wetland's vital, non-negotiable ecological functions. Things like flood control capacity, its biodiversity support role, its water filtration ability, its carbon storage potential. So it demands proactive, adaptive, and genuinely integrated water resource management, not just passive protection. It's about active stewardship alongside sustainable use.
That clarity is absolutely essential. Okay, let's distill our key factual and conceptual takeaways from this entire deep dive for the listener's notes. Let's focus first on those sharp prelims pointers.
Okay, for prelims pointers, absolutely memorize these facts. The Ramsar Convention. Know its origin city, Ramsar, Iran, the year 1971 adoption. Know India joined in 1981. Know its core focus is twofold: conservation and wise use. Know the Montreux Record, what it is, the International Register for Threatened Ramsar Sites, and what its listing signifies: immediate need for conservation action due to compromised ecological character. Know India's national nodal point, the National Wetland Conservation Program, NWCP. Understand the scale in India, based on source: 27,403 total wetlands, predominantly inland. And grasp the governance structure. States hold the primary management responsibility for the land and implementation, while the center coordinates and supports. Those are key factual pigs.
Excellent. And now for Maine's insights, thinking about the broader conceptual application, connecting this ecological knowledge to wider policy challenges, maybe GS Paper 3 areas like conservation, environment, disaster management.
I think the primary conceptual insight for Maine's revolves around the acute challenge of urban wetland management. The documented degradation of wetlands within and around major cities through relentless encroachment for construction, through being used as dumping grounds for sewage and solid waste. This directly and often immediately compromises their vital hydrological functions, especially flood control. We see this link playing out tragically in recent years in several Indian cities. The degradation of lakes and marshlands is increasingly cited as a major contributing factor to severe urban flooding events during heavy rains. So this links wetland health directly to broader issues of, frankly, often failed integrated urban planning, severe water resource management crises within cities, and demonstrably increased vulnerability to climate change-related extreme weather events. If a city systematically destroys its natural drainage system, its natural sponges, then severe recurrent flooding isn't just a risk, it becomes an almost inevitable documented consequence. Understanding this intersectionality, wetlands, urban planning, water management, disaster risk reduction, is highly relevant for Maine's answers dealing with governance, environment, and disaster management challenges in contemporary India.
That is a phenomenal synthesis of this absolutely critical material. Wetlands truly sit at the intersection, don't they? The nexus of the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the water security crisis. So, to leave you, our listeners, with a final provocative thought, building directly on their strategic importance that we've uncovered today. We discussed how coastal wetlands, especially mangroves and marshes, through that process of sequestering blue carbon, are among the planet's most powerful natural defenses against climate change. Rate-wise, maybe 5 times more effective than some forests. Simultaneously, they are our frontline physical defense against coastal storms and sea level rise. They are our most efficient natural water filters in many coastal zones. They are critical nurseries for fisheries. They are, in effect, our biggest coastal carbon vaults. Now, considering that these uniquely multifaceted, crucial ecosystems are documented as being lost faster than almost any other major natural system on Earth, what are the profound, perhaps existential implications of continuing this trajectory? Implications not just for the environment, but for national security, for economic stability, for planetary resilience. Think specifically about that trade-off we mentioned. When we destroy a hectare of mangrove, say for a short-term gain from an aquaculture pond or salt pan, we are trading long-term, multi-layered survival climate mitigation, flood defense, biodiversity, livelihoods for often precarious short-term economic gain. What is that persistent choice replicated thousands of times across the globe? Tell us about the current priorities, or perhaps the current failings of global environmental governance and national development planning. Something to really ponder.
A powerful and deeply necessary question to reflect on. Thank you for joining us, everyone, for this deep dive into the indispensable, complex, and increasingly threatened world of wetland ecosystems.
We hope this detailed exploration provides a solid foundation for your understanding. We'll catch you next time for more foundational knowledge delivered quickly and thoroughly right here on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Telegram and Instagram. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.